There is a man sitting somewhere right now, in a house that belongs entirely to him. And the world cannot stop trying to diagnose him. People see a man past 40 living alone, and the autopsy begins before he's even dead. The relationship must have collapsed. The woman must have left. The children must have grown distant. Surely he microwaves sad meals under fluorescent lighting while a clock ticks somewhere, counting down toward nothing. That is the screenplay people write for him without asking.
What about the money?
But here is where the screenplay falls apart. Walk into his life, actually walk in, and something doesn't match the narrative. The house isn't falling apart. His eyes aren't hollow. He isn't drowning in whiskey and regret. He's standing in his kitchen on a Saturday morning making pour-over coffee with the focus of a man defusing a bomb, and he looks fine, better than fine. He looks like someone who arrived somewhere on purpose. And that single observation breaks something fundamental about how we've been taught to think about men, about solitude, about what a successful life is supposed to look like. The mythology of the broken man. We carry a deeply inherited belief that operates like background software in every culture on Earth. A man alone is a man who failed. A man without a partner is a man still searching. A man in a quiet house is a man in a waiting room. This belief is so embedded that even well-meaning people cannot help themselves. They hear a man say he lives alone, and their voice drops half an octave, their head tilts. Their eyes soften into that specific expression that communicates, without words, "I'm so sorry that happened to you." What if nothing happened to him? What if something happened for him? Because across Western nations right now, a pattern is emerging that sociologists are only beginning to take seriously. Millions of men between their mid-40s and late 50s, predominantly from one particular generational cohort, are living alone. And a remarkable number of them are not just surviving the arrangement, they are thriving inside it, not performing contentment, not masking despair with hobbies, actually measurably, neurologically thriving, and the explanation for how they got there starts decades before anyone handed them a key to their own apartment. The generation that raised itself. Between 1965 and 1980, a generation was born into a world that was too busy restructuring itself to notice them. The cultural spotlight had already been claimed by the boomers. The millennials hadn't arrived yet to claim the next round. In between sat a cohort that would eventually be called Generation X. Though for most of their childhood, nobody called them anything at all. These were the children who came home from school to locked doors and empty kitchens. Not because their parents were cruel, but because the economic and social architecture of the 1970s and 1980s demanded two incomes, tolerated rising divorce rates, and offered almost zero infrastructure for what happened to a 9-year-old between 3:15 and 6:30 on a Wednesday. So the 9-year-old figured it out. He made his own food. He learned which burner on the stove was unreliable. He discovered that certain things should never enter a microwave, including ambition, tinfoil, and any attempt at cooking eggs. He navigated the neighborhood alone, mapped which houses were safe, which dogs would chase, which older kids to avoid. He processed all of this without a guidebook, a therapist, or a single adult asking how his afternoon went. Nobody framed this as psychological development. Nobody called it resilience training. They called it being a kid in 1983. But something was being built in those hours. Something invisible and structural, like rebar inside concrete. The boy was learning, through sheer repetition, that he could handle things alone. That silence was not threatening. That an empty room was not a crisis. That his own company was, in fact, adequate. Decades later, when that boy becomes a man standing in a quiet kitchen on a Saturday morning, the ease he feels isn't accidental. It was installed early. The operating system was written in those unsupervised afternoons, and it never got overwritten. The emotional architecture of fathers they couldn't read. There was another education happening simultaneously, and this one was darker. The fathers of Generation X were men forged in an earlier economy of emotion. They worked, they provided, they sat at the head of a table and presided over meals where conversation stayed on the surface, like oil on water. If they loved their children, and most of them did, that love expressed itself through labor, through showing up, through not leaving. What it almost never expressed itself through was language. A boy growing up in that environment learns something specific. He learns to read rooms the way a sailor reads weather, not through information but through atmosphere. He notices when his mother's posture changes. He notices when his father's silence shifts from comfortable to dangerous. He develops, without anyone teaching him, a sophisticated internal radar for emotional turbulence. This is not a deficiency. This is an advanced social skill acquired under pressure. But it comes with a cost. The boy who learns to read every room eventually gets tired of reading rooms, and the man he becomes often develops a profound, almost physical craving for a space where the atmospheric pressure is permanently stable, a space he controls, a home where nobody's mood is a weather system. He has to navigate before he can think his own thoughts. The contract nobody explained was changing. When this generation of men reached adulthood, they inherited a set of instructions that looked straightforward enough. Find a partner, build a home, provide financially, be strong, be steady, be present. Simple enough, except the world had started editing the terms of that contract in real time without issuing a revised copy. Women were gaining economic independence, educational dominance, and cultural voice, all of which were overdue and necessary. But the speed of the shift created a transitional zone where expectations became layered and contradictory. A man was expected to provide and defer, to lead and follow, to be emotionally available but never fragile, ambitious but never absent, traditionally masculine when the situation required it, progressively modern when the next situation required that instead, and he was expected to know which version was needed before anyone told him. The result was a generation of men trying to assemble a life from instructions that kept changing mid-sentence. Many of them tried anyway. They dated, they committed, they married, they bought houses and had children, and did every single thing the cultural template demanded. And for some of them, it worked beautifully. This is not their story. This is the story of the ones for whom the template eventually cracked. When the institution processes you, for men whose marriages ended, the dissolution itself often carried a specific quality that left a lasting imprint. A man walks into a legal proceeding believing he is a father, a partner, a person with history and context and years of accumulated meaning. The system receives him as a financial profile. Assets are divided, custody is calendared, support is calculated. The emotional complexity of 2 decades gets translated into spreadsheets and scheduled weekends. This is not a complaint about fairness in every individual case. It is an observation about experience. Across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, a statistically significant number of men describe the divorce process not as a painful but necessary transition, but as an encounter with machinery. An institutional processing that reduced the full dimension of their lives to numbers on forms. For the men who metabolize this experience well, and many eventually do, the lesson that crystallizes is not bitterness. It is precision, a clear-eyed understanding of which systems they will allow to have jurisdiction over their inner lives and which they will not. Not cynicism. Something closer to evidence-based boundary setting. They don't write manifestos. They don't join movements. They simply start making decisions differently. One choice at a time. Until those choices accumulate into a life that feels, for the first time, structurally sound. The first quiet evening. There is almost always a moment. A specific evening, usually unremarkable from the outside, where the shift begins. The apartment is half furnished. Boxes line the walls. A television sits on the floor because purchasing a proper stand feels absurd when the entire foundation of your life just reorganized itself. The refrigerator hums with an authority it shouldn't possess. The silence is aggressive at first. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. He expected loneliness. It arrived, briefly, like a guest who walks through a room without sitting down. But something else arrived behind it. Something that takes longer to identify because the culture has no ready-made name for it. Relief. No argument simmering in the next room. No emotional weather system requiring constant calibration. No performance of normalcy for an audience that includes 2 people who both know the performance is failing. Just space. Physical, temporal, emotional space. He bought the food he actually wanted to eat instead of the food that represented a negotiated compromise between two people's incompatible metabolisms. He slept in the center of the bed, diagonally if he chose, like a man expressing spatial freedom through geometry. He set the thermostat to his preferred temperature and experienced the strange, almost disorienting pleasure of a house that did exactly what he told it to do. The nervous system, which had been running on high alert for years, sometimes decades, began to downregulate. Not dramatically. Not overnight. But measurably. He slept better. He thought more clearly. He started walking after dinner instead of sitting in a room saturated with tension while everyone silently agreed that everything was fine, and at some point, the thing that was supposed to be a temporary phase of recovery quietly became a permanent way of living. Not a consolation prize. An upgrade. The man who never signed the contract. There is another route to the same destination, and it involves no divorce, no heartbreak, no dramatic rupture at all. Some men looked at the institutional arrangement of partnership early, understood its terms clearly, and simply declined. Not dramatically. Not with hostility, with the same quiet certainty of a man who reads a contract thoroughly, identifies clauses that don't serve his interests, and sets the document back on the table and signed. He watched friends marry. He attended the weddings and bought the gifts. He watched some of those marriages flourish and was genuinely happy for them. He watched others deteriorate and recognized patterns he had predicted years earlier. He never confused the failure of specific marriages with a failure of love itself. He simply concluded that the structure wasn't designed for him. His home, over the decades, became something precise. Not decorated in the way a magazine would approve of, but organized in a way that reflects a mind that knows itself. Every object is there because he chose it. Every system works because he built it. The kitchen is functional. The bookshelves are curated. He may own 0 decorative pillows and 7 flashlights, but every flashlight works, and he knows exactly where each one is. That is not a failure of domesticity. That is domesticity operating on a different set of principles. The widower's different silence. And then there is the path nobody chooses. The man whose solitude began with a loss so fundamental that the word loss feels inadequate. He loved someone completely. He kept his promises through the hardest possible version of what those promises meant. He learned things about caregiving, about grief, about the strange territory where devotion and exhaustion coexist in the same hour, that most people will never understand unless they've lived it. When it was over, when people told him he was still young, when they suggested that she would have wanted him to find happiness again, he felt something too complicated for their simple comfort to address. He wasn't opposed to love. He wasn't closed off. He simply recognized that what he'd built with one person was not a template that could be reapplied to another. His quiet house is not empty. It is full of someone. And the peace he eventually finds there is not the absence of feeling. It is feeling that has been carried long enough to become architecture. The science nobody expected. Here is where the conversation shifts from narrative to neuroscience, and where certain comfortable assumptions start to come apart. There is a framework in evolutionary psychology called the Savannah theory of happiness. Its central proposal is elegantly simple and its implications are profoundly disruptive. The human brain evolved in an environment of small nomadic bands, roughly 150 individuals. In that environment, social integration was not optional. It was survival. Being part of the group meant access to food, protection, reproductive opportunity. Being excluded meant death. So the brain developed powerful reward circuits around social belonging. Interaction feels good because, for most of human history, interaction kept you alive. But here is the disruption. For individuals with higher cognitive complexity, those ancient reward circuits exert less gravitational pull. The brain is flexible enough to meet its needs for stimulation, meaning, and satisfaction through internal processes, deep reading, creative work, strategic thinking, complex problem solving. The social belonging circuit still exists, but it doesn't dominate the reward landscape the way it does for the median population. The research finding that challenges nearly everything we assume about human happiness is this: for a significant subset of high-intelligence individuals, frequent obligatory social interaction actually decreases life satisfaction. Not because they dislike people. Because the cognitive load of constant social management disrupts the mental environment in which they function best. This does not mean intelligent people are antisocial. It means their optimal operating conditions include more silence, more autonomy, and fewer interruptions than the standard model assumes. For a man like the one we've been describing, solitude is not the absence of connection. It is the environment in which his mind works properly. The quiet isn't emptiness. It's occupied territory. Thoughts are living there. Ideas are under construction. The interior world is fully staffed. When someone asks why he'd rather stay home on a Friday night, the honest answer is something like, "My brain is currently running 47 simultaneous processes, and adding social interaction right now would be like opening another browser tab on a computer that's already questioning its own existence." He doesn't say that. He says he's busy. But what he means is that silence, for him, is not vacant space. It is workspace. Solitude is not loneliness, and the difference is everything. These two states share exactly one visible characteristic: a single person in a room alone. Beyond that surface resemblance, they are as different as swimming and drowning. Loneliness is involuntary isolation. It is the gap between the connection you need and the connection you have. It is painful, physiologically damaging, and associated with increased cortisol, inflammation, cardiovascular risk, and mortality. Loneliness is a health crisis, and no serious person disputes this. Solitude is chosen autonomy. It is the deliberate creation of space in which the self can operate without external interference. It is associated with creativity, self-knowledge, emotional regulation, and what psychologists call self-congruence, the alignment between who you are and how you live. The man we're discussing knows the difference because he has experienced both. He has been lonely. It felt like a room with no doors. He has chosen solitude. It feels like a room with every door open, where he simply prefers to stay. Confusing these two states is one of the most consequential errors in modern social commentary. It leads to policies, interventions, and cultural narratives that treat every alone person as a person in crisis, which is not only inaccurate but actively disrespectful to the millions of people who built their solitude with intention and maintain it with care. The marriage longevity myth, carefully examined. You've encountered the statistic. It circulates with the persistence of a cultural rumor that got promoted to fact. Married men live longer. It arrives in conversations as a gentle but firm warning. The solo life may feel good now, but the actuarial tables have opinions. Examined carefully, the data tells a more nuanced and ultimately more interesting story. The studies generating this finding typically compare married men against all unmarried men. That unmarried category is performing an extraordinary amount of statistical labor. It includes men who are involuntarily isolated, financially precarious, struggling with addiction, managing chronic illness that may have prevented partnership in the first place, recently bereaved, and recently divorced, which is its own acute health event. Comparing happily married, financially stable, socially integrated men against that entire troubled spectrum and concluding that the marriage certificate is the active ingredient is not rigorous science. As one epidemiologist noted with unusual directness, it is selection bias in formal attire. When researchers control for the variables that actually matter, voluntary social integration, financial stability, life satisfaction, genuine relationship quality, the picture reconfigures substantially. What predicts health and longevity is not marital status. It is quality of connection and presence of volition. A man in a high-conflict marriage shows elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep architecture, higher blood pressure, and worse cardiovascular markers than a man living alone by choice with strong social bonds. The marriage is not protecting him. The marriage is the stressor. Meanwhile, the socially integrated solo man, the one who maintains genuine friendships, hosts people, engages with his community, stays physically active, and actually chose his arrangement rather than having it imposed on him, shows health markers that rival or exceed those of the average married man. The marriage certificate is not a medical intervention. It is a legal document. What heals is connection. What protects is peace. What kills, slowly and measurably, is chronic interpersonal stress with no exit. The kitchen is workshop, laboratory, and social hub. Here is something hiding in demographic data that deserves more attention than it receives. He can cook. And not in the way that means he can heat soup without incident. In the way that means he has opinions about knife steel, preferences about heat distribution in cast iron, a vendor at the farmer's market whose produce he trusts, and a braising technique he's refined over the course of several years and will defend with an intensity usually reserved for religious conviction. Fatherhood without cohabitation. The stereotype writes itself. The divorced father, reduced to every other weekend appearances, fumbling through activities he planned out of obligation, counting hours until he returns the children to their real home. That version exists. But it is not the only version, and in many cases, it is not the accurate one. Generation X fathers are measurably different from the fathers who raised them. They watched emotional absence disguised as masculine strength and made a deliberate decision not to replicate it. They are more willing to say the vulnerable thing, more comfortable sitting inside a difficult conversation without redirecting it, more likely to respond to a child's confusion with, "I'm not sure either." Let's figure it out together, rather than performing omniscience they don't possess. The father who has his children on a structured schedule often brings something specific to those days that continuous cohabitation can actually erode: intentionality. He planned the weekend because he wanted to, not because proximity made it automatic. He cooked something they loved because he was thinking about them during the week. He is operating at full capacity because he spent the days between visits taking care of himself, maintaining his equilibrium, doing the quiet internal work that makes presence possible. Research on single-father households consistently finds that children in these environments develop outcomes far better than cultural stereotypes predict. What children require for healthy development is not a specific residential configuration. It is a caregiver who shows up with consistency, attention, and emotional availability. The address where this happens matters less than the quality of consciousness that fills the room. The father who taught his child to make eggs properly, who sat with them through a hard emotion without flinching, who demonstrated that a man can live alone and be whole. That is not a diminished version of parenting. That is parenting that works. The romantic life nobody asks about correctly. Women find him attractive. This is not speculation. It is observation. Not because of performance or strategy or whatever the internet has decided constitutes masculine appeal this week. Because of settling. The internal kind. The energy of a man who is no longer auditioning for anyone's approval, no longer constructing a version of himself designed to secure interest, no longer operating from deficit. He notices the interest. He may welcome it. He may pursue it. He may be in a relationship right now that is, by every meaningful measure, deeply fulfilling. But here is what defines his arrangement. It has architecture. Psychologists studying what is called the self-expansion model have found that financially independent women, and the current generation of women represents the most financially autonomous female population in recorded history, are not primarily seeking material provision from a partner. They seek novelty, growth, psychological richness, and, critically, the settled energy that only comes from a person who has done genuine internal work. A man who knows himself, who has stopped performing, who can be present without being desperate, registers differently in this framework. He is not offering dependency. He is offering partnership between two complete people. And the women drawn to this are often equally independent, equally self-possessed, equally uninterested in merging their identity into a shared domestic project. The arrangement this produces has a name in demographic literature: living apart together, or LAT. Two people in a genuine committed relationship who maintain separate residences by mutual choice. Not as a compromise. Not as a transitional stage. As the preferred configuration. They see each other with genuine desire. They share emotional depth, vulnerability, even love, in the fullest sense of the word. And then they go home. To their own space. To their own silence. To the version of themselves that exists only when no one else is in the room. Research on LAT relationships among adults over 50 consistently shows positive mental health outcomes. The structure provides the benefits of intimacy while removing the specific stressors of cohabitation that erode attraction over time, the slow domestication of desire, the gradual conversion of a partner into a logistics coordinator, the quiet death of mystery that occurs when two people share a bathroom for long enough. He wants to miss her occasionally. That sounds minor. It is not. Missing someone means the relationship is still being entered, not merely continued. It means desire is regenerative rather than residual. The space between them is not distance, it is the oxygen that keeps the flame from becoming an ember. A global phenomenon with local addresses. This is not an isolated Western curiosity. It is a global demographic restructuring. Japan arrived at this territory first and built an economy around it. The concept of ohaidorizuma, the art and practice of doing things alone without apology, has generated an entire commercial ecosystem estimated at approximately $80 billion. Solo dining, solo travel, solo entertainment, all designed not to accommodate loneliness but to honor individual autonomy. Restaurants feature privacy partitions. Karaoke rooms are built for one voice. Hotels market solitude as luxury, not as the absence of something better. By 2035, demographic projections suggest that half of all Japanese citizens over 15 will live alone. The societal response has not been panic. It has been adaptation. Which is, in its pragmatic way, a deeper form of respect than pity ever could be. Germany currently has 17 million people living alone, representing 20% of its entire population. Research on midlife solo dwellers in German cities found that the single variable that separates those who thrive from those who struggle is not the living arrangement itself, it is the quality and intentionality of their social network. People who actively maintain diverse connections flourish. People who passively wait for connection to find them do not. The structure is neutral. The person inside it is decisive. Across the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, 36% of all households headed by someone over 50 now contain a single occupant. Demographers have stopped treating this as an anomaly to be explained and started treating it as population structure to be understood. The man we've been describing is not ahead of a trend. He is inside a trend that the culture hasn't fully acknowledged yet because acknowledging it requires relinquishing the belief that partnership is the default setting and solitude is the error state. The loneliness that lives inside relationships. There is a form of isolation that doesn't look like isolation at all. It lives inside marriages. Inside shared homes. Inside beds where two people sleep 3 inches apart and feel continents away from each other. The loneliness of being with someone who no longer sees you is qualitatively different from being alone, and for many men, it is worse. Because at least solitude is honest. At least an empty room doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. At least silence, when it's genuine, doesn't carry the weight of words that should have been said but weren't. Many of these men know this loneliness intimately. They lived inside it for years. They smiled through family dinners while something essential slowly starved. They performed partnership for an audience of 2, both of whom knew the performance was failing, neither of whom knew how to stop. Compared to that, a quiet house is not empty. It is clean. The earned quiet. There is a specific quality to the satisfaction these men describe that is difficult to capture because it is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look impressive from the outside. It looks like a man washing dishes after dinner while a podcast plays in the background and the dog sleeps on the kitchen floor. But inside that ordinary moment, something is present that was absent for years. Maybe decades. Congruence. The alignment between who he is and how he lives. The absence of performance. The end of the gap between his public face and his private experience. For the first time, possibly in his entire adult life, the interior and exterior match. He hosts friends on his own schedule. He maintains relationships that matter through genuine effort. He feeds people he cares about. He shows up when someone needs him. And then he returns to a house that asks nothing of him except to exist inside it. The research, when read carefully and without ideological filters, supports what he already knows. Connection drives health. Volition drives satisfaction. Peace drives longevity. Not legal status. Not residential configuration. Not the presence of another person's name on the mortgage. His boundaries look excessive from the outside. From the inside, they are load-bearing walls. Remove them, and the structure he's built collapses. He knows this because he's lived the collapse before. He is not building the same house twice. What he is not. He is not a cautionary tale. He is not a man who needs a concerned article forwarded to his inbox. He is not waiting for someone to finally arrive and complete him. He is not performing independence as a defense mechanism against vulnerability. He is not broken, bitter, avoidant, or afraid. He is a man who examined the available options with the full benefit of experience, who tried the default template and found it incompatible with his operating system, who endured the consequences of that discovery, and who rebuilt with the kind of precision that only becomes possible when you stop building for an audience. Saturday morning. The coffee is exactly right. The mug is where he left it. Nobody moved it. Nobody started a conversation before his brain finished its startup sequence. There's a book on the table that has been waiting patiently for this morning, and the morning has finally arrived. The dog shifts position on the floor. Sunlight crosses the kitchen counter at the angle it always crosses at this hour. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor starts a lawnmower, which is the suburban equivalent of a rooster crowing, equally pointless and equally traditional. He has nowhere to be for several hours. He knows this with the specific certainty of a man who controls his own schedule, and inside that knowledge lives a quality of peace that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who has never had to fight for it. This is not the absence of a life. This is the life. He built it. It's his. And Saturday morning belongs to no one else.